Hello and welcome. I'm Sadaslan Shafkhanov and you're watching Interview on Uzreport World. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has been one of Uzbekistan's most committed investors. With a portfolio of over 1.8 billion euros, the bank has invested heavily into road infrastructure, sustainable energy and private sector development. EBRD President Sir Suma Chakraborty has arrived in Uzbekistan with a two-day visit to meet with the President and the bank's clients here in Uzbekistan. Over the next 10 minutes, Sir Chakraborty and I will discuss the visit and see what other areas require further reconstruction and development. Sir Chakraborty, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
A rather busy agenda. What can you tell us about your two-day visit here in Uzbekistan?
So, first of all, I think one of the key things to say is that we have been back in Uzbekistan, the new beginning, if I may put it, in our relationship, for just 3 years. So the first thing I wanted to do was take stock with the President, with the Minister of Investment and Foreign Trade, as to where we've got to. And we have all agreed that it's been an amazingly successful re-entry by EBRD. $1.1 billion of fresh investments over that period, 33 projects across a range of sectors. We have now 33 staff on the ground. We had just 2 back here 3 years ago. We've opened an office, not just in Tashkent, of course, but also in Andijan, an office in Urgench, which will be open very soon. So we took stock and we said we've achieved a huge amount. The second thing was, how do we maintain this momentum? And here I think the key thing is the reforms that are happening, both political and economic reforms, that allow us, I think, to have hope that we will have similarly large investment levels in the years ahead. Last year, Uzbekistan was the 7th largest market for EBRD at $580 million. And I think we need to keep up that rate of investment. So we discussed some of the sectors that we were going to invest in and some of the reforms we want to help with.
Looking back, how has the investment climate changed since your last visit here in June?
Well, it's very recent. I mean, June to now is less than a year. But I think what we're seeing is a growing appreciation for what foreign investors want to see in terms of investment climate reforms. And I think one of the things foreign investors want to see, particularly in their interactions with government, is a government that is very clear about fighting corruption, very clear about the procurement processes, very clear about standards, if you like. And also, they always like to see governments that are consistent in their long-term policies. So they don't like chopping and changing of policies, which might make projects unviable. And I think they feel more and more, as the government and the President, with showing leadership on this, has set out a future course, that they're getting more confident about the country. You know, it's no accident that Uzbekistan was Country of the Year in 2019 in The Economist. I mean, it's partly political reform, of course, but it's also the economic course set by the President, which has been very much appreciated. And if you compare that, not just with last June, but go back to 3 years ago when EBRD came back in, we can see reform is irreversible now. That is something that all investors like. And that's why it's good to now create this Foreign Investors Council. And I'm hoping that'll meet in November. And it'll be a very successful council if it can then showcase some of the new investors that have come in and also showcase opportunities for new investment opportunities, not just for existing investors, but for new ones who don't know yet the country.
And what kind of opportunities are we talking about?
Well, I think they range across the sector. One of the great things about Uzbekistan is, firstly, it's a much more densely populated country than many others in Central Asia. So there's actually quite a good domestic market size, if you like. But it's also not an economy that depends on one or two sectors. It's actually quite a balanced economy and a number of different commodities that are available. So I think if you look at EBRD's own prospects for the coming years, I think you'll see us in infrastructure, in energy. I mean, the gas sector, I think particularly will be quite important. Natural resources and mining, I think will become more important too. But also the sector, the agricultural sector, agribusiness, I think increasingly. And fundamentally, I do not know any successful emerging market that doesn't have a really booming SME sector. So that's another thing that we're going to focus on a lot in terms of helping domestic small and medium-sized enterprises grow, become more successful going forward, both with advisory services, but also with credit lines and finance as well.
What documents were signed during your visit?
Well, we signed, we've signed so many documents in the past few months, but this visit we only focused on one signing, which is the Tashkent thermal power plant's signing. That's an important project. It's to help restructure the financing of those plants. But I think I would focus more on, in the future, not just on signings. Signings are good things to do. They're nice events. They're a sign of health, if you like, in the pipeline, in the relationship between the government and the private sector and the EBRD. But it's important for them to implement. So the important thing now ahead of us is to implement these projects so that all these signings get turned into tangible changes for people, citizens of Uzbekistan. They can feel the changes on the ground. So part of that discussion today with the President was very much focused on implementation.
Great. Now let's talk about future. The EBRD is planning to open a Karachi, Pakistan office. Can you give us a reason for the choice of location?
Yeah, look, I mean, we discussed in some depth with the President back in June last year the idea of opening a third office in the country, and I had went out at his suggestion to the Urgench area. I went also to the RLC, not far away, to take a look at what had happened. And it's obviously a devastating picture in terms of what's happened there to the sea. But it's also a challenge, really, for a development institution like ourselves and for Uzbekistan to see whether we can actually create businesses and SMEs to try and help that region recover, really, and to regenerate the region. So that's why that office is placed there, to try and actually focus on the SME growth in that region. But it won't be just SMEs, we'll also be looking for local larger companies as well, and strategic investors who might go there. But the initial task will be very much focused on SMEs.
Speaking of SMEs, have there been any lessons drawn from the Andijan office, which I assume was focusing on small and medium-sized businesses?
I mean, it's a bit early to focus on lessons learned. It's just got off the ground. So I think give us a year or two and then we'll have some lessons learned, I'm sure. But it's already proving to be useful, already reaching out to a wide base of clients. I was yesterday in the Kokand region and saw a SME silk manufacturer, if you like. Quite interesting. The techniques, the ways of working were very interesting, but I think it's a company that's actually quite important in terms of the way it works with female labour force, with people with disabilities as well, to try and include them in the labour force. But I think it's also a company that could do with some advisory support on how to run the processes and maybe modernise some of the processes. They're still using a lot of processes which are, I think, not just our grandparents, our great-great-great-grandparents might well recognise. And so some mechanisation, some modernisation of those processes will be something that we would like to help them with, actually, and so they get more value added. That's an example of the sort of work that Andijan office and the Urgench office will be able to do in future as well.
Looking further still, are there any specific areas the EBRD wants to focus on?
Yeah, I think there are two major areas beyond the ones I mentioned, and one is the banking sector. All successful emerging markets really need a banking sector that does its job, that actually allocates savings into investments which are really viable, commercially, economically viable, really does its job in channeling funds. And we believe that the Uzbek banking sector has some way to go on that. So we are really beginning to start work with some of the banks on that. And I hope over time there'll be more privatization in this sector too that will help. The second area is state enterprises. Now, it's no accident that we have economies like Uzbekistan, which have a legacy of, in this case, a former Soviet approach to the economy, high number of state enterprises, high share of the state in the GDP of the country. That all needs to change. And we know that, and the President has very much made that clear. So we would like to now work very hard on privatization of state enterprises. I would like us to really challenge ourselves that if the government makes a pledge to move down the privatization route, and we think this is an enterprise that could make a success in the private sector, we try to take debt finance, equity, maybe early on in the process, and actually try to help make the company, the enterprise, fit for the private sector. So that's going to be, I think, two of the areas, banking and state enterprises, where we want to make a bigger difference, along with all the other areas I've already mentioned earlier.
Renewables?
Renewables, absolutely, certainly. You know, EBRD is the number one multilateral bank in the renewables sector. And Uzbekistan, with both solar and wind, has real possibilities. So we are looking at that too. And we expect to do more investment in that too.
The ADB has its $800 million project to build 1 gigawatt in solar capacity, and so does the IFC. Are there any plans to match these IFIs with an EBRD alternative?
Yes, I think we've been looking at particularly the IFC work in Samarkand on the solar. We have been looking at hydro projects too, and we've been considering some private sector renewables projects as well. I think with a couple of companies I won't mention, these are commercially confidential still, but companies that we've worked with in other countries, and we expect to work with them in Uzbekistan too. So I think you should be hearing about those projects very soon. But yes, I expect renewables to be a big part of what we do. I should just say, I mean, EBRD's track record across all our 38 countries of operation last year, which was a record year for us in total investment levels of over 10 billion euros, 46% of all our investments were in the green economy space, well ahead of our target of 40%. So this is something we are really strong in, and I would like Uzbekistan to be one of the countries that we highlight in future for this effort.
Sir Chakraborty, these are your concluding months as president of the EBRD and maybe your last visit in this capacity. How can you recap your experience in Uzbekistan?
It has been, in my, I guess, thinking about my 40-year career, one of the highest points for me. From a relationship that was comatose some 3 years ago to now a very, very lively partnership. A completely transformation. I mean, and that is not possible without the leadership and strategic direction that the president has shown here. That's what's made the big difference. We can then use all our resources, our assets, our knowledge, our experience to make a reality of that partnership. But it's also shown, I think, that if we can do this in Uzbekistan, we can do it in other markets too. Difficult markets, but where there is suddenly a push for change, that EBRD can be at the forefront of that. So it's a high point for me, but it's also a lesson, I think, for all of us about the sort of ingredients you need to make a success of development.
Sir Chakraborty, thank you for this insightful conversation. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
This has been our conversation with Sir Sumo Chakraborty, EBRD President, following his 2-day visit to Uzbekistan. I am Seraslav Shavkhanov, and you've been watching Interview on UzReport World. Thank you. Goodbye.